It is the adventure story of a millennium.
It's a story of continental sweep and eventually of global significance.
And it cut right through the heart of the West. The rugged Rocky Mountains shattered hopes and proved to be one of the most difficult legs of the entire 3-year journey.
This is not just the story of triumph, it is also the story of tragedy and of suffering and of pain and of anguish.
This is the story of the expedition of Lewis and Clark in what we now call Idaho, a journey with unexpected hardship and powerful allies as the explorers ventured from the mountains to the sea.
When Lewis and Clark first embarked on their historic journey, they carried with them an idea, a geographic theory of what they might encounter out west. President Thomas Jefferson called it the Northwest Passage, a mythical waterway said to connect the rivers of the eastern United States to the Pacific Ocean. Jefferson directed Lewis and Clark to find the waterway to promote commerce in the expanding nation. But what they found instead would shatter years of speculation and along the way change many lives forever.
At the turn of the 19th century, the United States ended at the Mississippi River. The Spanish, French, and British empires claimed much of the American West. But President Thomas Jefferson had an imperial vision for westward expansion.
What we're seeing with Lewis and Clark is the beginning of what you could call the War for the West.
In January of 1803, Congress approved a $2,500 budget to fund a corps of discovery. The expedition was charged with exploring the water, land, and people west of the Mississippi River. Then, in April, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the nation and gave added importance to the mission.
Well, they had two sort of large goals set out for them. One goal was, just to get across the continent. And that was the primary goal that Jefferson set for them, this geographic goal, to determine if there was this Northwest Passage, to find a connecting stream or connections between the two great rivers of the West, the Missouri and the Columbia. The other were sort of national goals. That is, the United States had acquired the Louisiana Purchase, so Jefferson was sending Lewis and Clark out there to answer the question, what did we get in this bargain?
Assigned to the task were two young Army captains by the names of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Lewis, the naturalist and scientist, would notate and describe dozens of species of plants and animals. Clark, the cartographer, would carefully chart and draw maps of the entire route. Together, they would lead a crew of 29 men, a woman, and a baby across an uncharted continent and back again. The adventure began in March of 1803. Supplies and men were gathered, and the Corps of Discovery spent its first winter near St. Louis, Missouri. The spring of 1804 set the full expedition in motion. It would take more than a year for the Corps of Discovery to push, paddle, and pull up the Missouri River through foreign Indian nations, raging rapids, and what is now Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, and Montana. Then in August of 1805, as summer faded into fall, the party's progress slowed to a miserable crawl. The upper reach of the Missouri was running out. The season was growing late, and the river becoming too shallow for canoes. Lewis and Clark realized their hopes for continuing the journey west now relied on finding Indians and trading for horses.
Lewis and Clark need to find horses to cross the divide. Based on Jefferson's geography of hope, they still believed at that point that they could cross the continental divide, that horses could carry their equipment over the divide, and that on the other side, they would find waters that would take them to the Columbia. So finding the Shoshones and finding horses was a very important part of the expedition's strategy, its scheme for finding the Pacific.
Just days earlier, a young Indian woman on board recognized a major landmark called the Beaver's Head. She said it was not very distant from the summer retreat of her people. The Indian woman was a Lemhi Shoshone named Sacagawea. Sacagawea grew up in the Lemhi Valley of present-day Idaho. Kidnapped as a young girl by a raiding Minotari war party and sold as a slave, she was finally returning to her homeland. Joined by her French husband Toussaint Charbonneau and her infant son Jean-Baptiste, Sacagawea served as an interpreter and guide to Lewis and Clark.
Sacagawea's strength came from her culture. It came from her way of life. But I think most importantly, it was the fact that she was coming home.
Few homecomings would be marked with the good fortune of Sacagawea's reunion with her people. As the expedition approached the present-day border between Montana and Idaho, Captain Lewis would move ahead with a small advance party. A well-traveled Indian trail led them alongside a dwindling tributary of the river they had followed for more than a year and a half. Now, finally, its end was in sight.
August 12, 1805. The road took us to the most distant fountain of the waters of the mighty Missouri, in search of which we have spent so many toilsome days and restless nights. Captain Meriwether Lewis.
The mighty Missouri could be straddled with two legs, but Lewis's mind remained fixed on what lay ahead.
I did not despair of shortly finding a passage over the mountains and of tasting the waters of the great Columbia this evening.
But as Lewis strode up the grassy saddle of Lemhi Pass, he saw a sight that shattered the hopes of his nation. The first European American to set foot in what is now Idaho saw not an easy path to the waters of the Columbia, but a complex series of snow-capped peaks that stretched beyond the horizon.
We proceeded on to the top of the dividing ridge from which I discovered immense ranges of high mountains still to the west of us, with their tops partially covered with snow. Captain Meriwether Lewis.
As Lewis came to the crest at the pass, he thought he was going to find a simple west. What he found now was an enormously complex west. A west of endless mountains, of rivers that were not navigable. And so there must have been a sense of dream shattering to nightmare.
That night, Lewis recorded the events of his fateful day in his journal. He also described two new species to science, the sage grouse and the deep purple currant. Hopefully he'd find a way through the mountains. Hopefully tomorrow would be a better day. The Lemhi Valley of Idaho was a seasonal home for the Lemhi Shoshone, or Agadika tribe. Here they caught salmon from the abundant waters, hunted antelope, and foraged for berries. Sacagawea knew her people were near, but she had been left behind, moving slowly up the shallow river with the main party. She did not catch sight of a single Shoshone until suddenly, on August 17th, Lewis's advance party returned from their scouting trip. They had found her people and brought with them a large group of Shoshone, including the chief himself.
That was the most pivotal point, where fate came into hand. It was where Sacagawea met her people, but I think most importantly, it was where she found that Kimiawat was her brother.
Indeed, as the expedition members sat down with Kimiawat and Sacagawea prepared to translate, she recognized in the chief her long-lost brother.
And this is one of those moments when the stars dance for Lewis and Clark. When now, Sacagawea will not only cement the relationship, but now will become vital in the interpretation, for language, for building friendship, and of course, for getting those horses. It's a great moment. It's one of the great Lewis and Clark moments.
Lewis and Clark stayed in the company of the Shoshones for 2 weeks. Soon they got down to the important business of trading for horses. What the Shoshones really wanted were guns to protect themselves from enemy tribes. But with few guns to spare, Lewis and Clark instead offered items of utility, metal knives, iron axes, and promises of American commerce to come. In return, the expedition gathered a herd of 29 horses. Chief Camillawat proved himself a powerful new ally, also offering valuable geographic information to Lewis and Clark.
Over and over again, American explorers relied on Indian maps and on Indian guides. Without those maps, without those guides, the American exploration of the West would have been a very different enterprise.
Camillawat warned them the large river that flowed through the valley was not a navigable waterway to the ocean, but the explorers had to see for themselves. A 3-day reconnaissance trip by Captain Clark down the Salmon River proved Camillawat was right. Towering cliffs hemmed in the river, creating narrow, dangerous chutes that drowned any hopes of an easy passage to the ocean. Instead, they loaded up their horses, bid farewell to their new Shoshone friends, and turned toward those daunting mountains. The Bitterroot Mountains reach above 8,000 feet, with peaks almost perennially capped in snow. The range contributes to the great Continental Divide, which splits the rivers of the eastern United States from the rivers of the west. Lewis and Clark knew the Nez Perce lived on the other side. There, west of the Bitterroots, they would likely find a river that would take them to the ocean. Now, they just had to get there.
But crossing the Rocky Mountains is the heart and soul of the expedition. It's the key to the entire trip. They had no idea that the Rockies are not a single chain of mountains, chain after chain after chain of mountains, more than 100 separately named mountain ranges in western Montana and northern Idaho alone.
Led by a Shoshone guide named Old Toby, the explorers moved up today's Lost Trail Pass, a rocky and slippery path that caused several horses to fall and roll down the slope. It was a miserable route, worsened by freezing rain and dense underbrush.
September 3rd, 1805. This day we passed over immense hills and some of the worst road that ever horses passed. Our horses frequently fell. Captain William Clark.
With the icy mountains looming up ahead, morale among the group dwindled to a new low. But on September 4th, they met with a pleasant surprise. Here, just beyond Lost Trail Pass, in the broad and grassy Bitterroot Valley of present-day Montana, the explorers met a tribe of Salish Indians. The encounter placed the expedition in a much-improved position for crossing the Bitterroots. They now had 40 horses, plus 3 colts to be used as reserve food supply. From here, they marched 4 days and camped on the south bank of Lolo Creek. The captains called for a 1-day halt at the site they named Traveler's Rest, near present-day Lolo, Montana. It was a day for relaxing. The horses filled their bellies on the plentiful lush grass, and the explorers prepared themselves for the difficult mountain crossing.
September 11th, 1805. The hills on the right high and rugged, the mountains on the left high and covered with snow. Captain William Clark.
On September 11th, 1805, Lewis and Clark turned their horses westward and headed straight toward the mountains. The next 2 weeks would be spent crossing the most challenging stretch of their entire 4,000-mile route. The country was stony, steep, and unrelenting. 3 days' travel brought them through Lolo Hot Springs, where the men marveled at the naturally hot water. And then they crossed back into present-day Idaho and stopped at Glade Creek, where they camped on the night of September 13th. The grassy meadow, with its meandering stream, must have seemed a safe haven deep in the heart of the mountains.
September 14th, 1805. A cloudy day in the valleys. It rained and hailed. On top of the mountain, some snow fell. Captain William Clark.
The day began on a sour note with wet, cold weather. From there, things got worse. After climbing a large hill out of the glade, old Toby took a wrong turn. Instead of following the main Nez Perce trail along the ridgetop, he took the entire expedition down a more worn path to an Indian salmon fishery on the Loxa River. It was a terrible detour down steep and stony slopes on a trail littered with dead bulls. Clark complained in his journal of the excessively bad condition. To make matters worse, there was little game in the mountains. That night at camp, the men were compelled to kill a colt, or as Clark put it, the want of meat. The sacrifice was then immortalized in the naming of Colt Killed Creek. Rations were running dangerously low, and they had lost the trail. But the intrepid explorers still took time to note several species of trees they saw that day: lodgepole pine, Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, and tamarack.
What's remarkable is that in spite of the conditions that they encountered, severe weather, enormous mountain ranges, and potential starvation, that they continued to collect and write about over 100 plant and animal species in Idaho alone.
September 15th, 1805. We set out early, the morning cloudy, and proceeded on down the right side of the river. Captain William Clark.
In order to get back up to the ridgetop and onto the trail old Toby had missed, the explorers faced a grueling uphill ordeal, a 3,500-foot climb straight up the side of a mountain. Several horses stumbled and fell. Equipment rolled down the mountain, tangled and broken in the underbrush. The group only made 12 miles this day. They managed to make it back to the main trail. That night they collapsed, hungry and tired, with nothing killed all day except 2 small pheasants. The situation was bad, but it was about to get much worse. Saturday, September 16th, 1805, Clark awoke at 3 a.m. to snowfall. By daylight, 4 inches blanketed their bedroll. The early September storm caught the expedition off guard. Some of the men had no socks, were forced to wrap shreds of rags around their feet for warmth. They set off with empty stomachs and sullen hearts.
September 16th, 1805. I walked in front to keep the road and found great difficulty in keeping it, as in many places the snow had entirely filled up the track. Captain William Clark.
The trail was covered by nearly a foot of snow. Several times the expedition was forced to stop and hunt for the trail. Trees, laden with snow, dumped their loads on passing explorers.
In passing them, we are continually covered with snow. I've been wet and as cold in every part as I ever was in my life. Indeed, I was at one time fearful my feet would freeze in the thin moccasins which I wore. Captain William Clark.
Adding insult to injury, Clark's gun malfunctioned, and he missed a shot at a large black-tailed deer. Even the best of the expedition's hunters had similar poor luck, missing shots at the scarce few game animals they saw. That night at camp, another colt fell prey to their ravenous appetite.
Think of the crossing of the Lolo Trail as a bitter odyssey in the snow. September, early snow, a tangle of underbrush, freezing cold and little to eat, and being easily lost, snowblind almost. What they had hoped they were going to find was the easy passage through the garden. And now what they really found was terrible suffering and struggle and anguish.
6 days into the mountain crossing and only halfway through the mountain, the expedition was at a breaking point. On the night of September 17th, they made a drastic decision. They decided to split up.
Very dangerous, chancy decision. Of course, dividing the party was a risk, but they were willing to balance the benefits against the risk.
The next morning, Captain Clark went ahead with 6 hunters. Their hopes rested on finding some level country with game. The speedy advance party made 32 miles this day. Clark finally caught sight of some good news.
September 18th, 1805. From the top of a high part of the mountain, at 20 miles I had a view of an immense plain and level country to the southwest and west at a great distance. Captain William Clark.
It was a level, grassy prairie. The end of these horrible mountains was finally in view. On September 20th, 1805, Clark and the advance party stumbled out of the mountains, half-starved and exhausted. Soon, they surprised 3 Nez Perce boys who ran for cover. Clark found 2 of the boys hiding in the grass. He offered them gifts of ribbon and asked them to take them to their chief. The beginning of an exchange that would have a lasting impact on the Nez Perce people. Kindness abounded. The Nez Perce shared buffalo, salmon, and roots with the explorers. The men gorged themselves. And they soon paid a high price. The strange foods caused horrible stomach upset, cramping, and sickness. It would be days before they would finally feel well again. In the meantime, Clark tended to diplomacy. He offered gifts of tobacco, handkerchiefs, and knives. He presented the chief Twisted Hair with a peace medallion featuring an embossed portrait of Thomas Jefferson, whom Clark called the chief above all others. One of the Nez Perce chiefs drew Clark a map of the river, its large rapids and falls, and its final outcome at the Pacific Ocean. For those few Nez Perce who remained suspicious of the strange white men, an elderly woman named Watkuis calmed their fears. She convinced the Nez Perce the white men were good and kind. She told her people to do them no harm. It was an admonishment that may well have saved the explorers' lives.
Surely, Lewis and Clark could have lost their lives. The expedition could have been rubbed out, except for the hospitality, for the generosity of native people.
On September 22nd, Lewis and the main party caught up with Clark. Together, they camped and ate with the Nez Perce. They had conquered the Bitterroots. But the fearsome landscape of Idaho destroyed their hopes of an easy northwest passage. It was a painful discovery that would leave an indelible mark on the hearts and minds of these brave explorers. With October coming on, Lewis and Clark wasted no time in getting to work building 5 new dugout canoes. But illness from the foreign foods still plagued many of the men. So, to reduce their labor, they adopted the Nez Perce technique of burning out the centers. The charred pieces were then chopped out easily with an axe. On October 7, 1805, the last of 5 canoes was finished and the expedition ready once again to travel by water. Clark made arrangements with the Nez Perce to watch the horses until the expedition returned in the spring. Baggage was packed, men were loaded. and at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they shoved off, headed down the Clearwater River with 2 Nez Perce guides. In just 3 days, the swift current would sweep the crew out of present-day Idaho. They continued down the Snake River to the Columbia and on to the Pacific Ocean. The mountains of Idaho were now just a bitter memory, but one they would soon have to face again.
Years later, several members of the expedition would recall the westbound trip through the Bitterroots as the worst portion of the entire cross-continental journey. Still, they made it. And that November, Captain Clark expressed his famous quote, "Great joy in camp. We are in view of the ocean." The mighty Pacific was finally realized. The winter at Fort Clatsop, however, was far from joyful. Game was scarce, and conditions were poor with almost continual rain and cold weather.
By early spring of 1806, the group was on the move again. By May 5th, they had re-entered what is now Idaho, and by May 10th, they were once again welcomed into the Nez Perce camp of Chief Twisted Hair. There, they were reunited with their horses, which Twisted Hair had faithfully watched over the winter. But deep snows in the Bitterroots would hold the explorers down in the valley for nearly a month. Their stay at Long Camp, or Camp Chopinish on the Clearwater River, was largely spent playing games, gathering food, and getting to know and appreciate their Nez Perce neighbors.
May 13th, 1806. The Chopinish are in general stout, well-formed, active men with cheerful and agreeable countenances. They are expert marksmen and good riders. Captain Meriwether Lewis.
But for all their admiration of the Nez Perce, Lewis and Clark chose to ignore Nez Perce warnings that, even though it was June, the snows remained too deep to cross the mountain. On June 15th, tired of waiting for winter to loosen its icy grasp on the Lolo Trail, the explorers packed up and headed for the hills. It soon proved a foolish decision. Horses slipped and fell as the snow rose to depths of 10 or more feet. On June 17, 1806, the expedition made its one and only turnaround. Captain Lewis politely called it a retrograde march. 1 week later, they would try again, this time with the help of Nez Perce guides, and this time with little incident.
Well, some people have said that, in many ways they failed. They failed at the goals that Jefferson set for them. The primary goal, find these connecting streams, find the Northwest Passage, find an easy route across the continent, it just wasn't there. They failed at that.
In so many ways, the story in modern Idaho is the story of expectations colliding with realities. This is a story that ought to empower us. If ordinary people can do extraordinary things in a republic, then so can we.
Today, there is much to be learned from the expedition of Lewis and Clark. Many portions of the trail remain virtually unchanged from when Lewis and Clark passed this way some 200 years ago. In Idaho, the spirit of Lewis and Clark lingered in places like Lemhi Pass, the Lolo Trail, Glade Creek campsite along the Clearwater River, and at many of the campsites where Lewis and Clark laid down their weary bodies to rest. These places are treasured for every American to enjoy. Some have been developed for driving, hiking, or camping. Others are preserved as spiritual places for Idaho's native tribes. All serve to improve our understanding of Idaho's past and enrich our present.
I'm George Kennedy, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. But mostly, I encourage you to explore for yourself Idaho's lasting legacy of Lewis and Clark.